Welcome for those of you who finally were able to get in and join us. New format for us today.
Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here. This is, like Renee said, a new format for us, so please be patient with us. Our tech people are outstanding, but we may need patience anyways.
And I want to say, aren't we happy we have Zoom, because it's quite chilly, and I'm kind of glad I'm sitting in my home tonight participating in this, not driving College Avenue and going to Copper Rock. Although I'd like to see all your faces.
Agreed.
All right, so this is Renee Gralowitz. I am the League of Women Voters Appleton Program, Program Vice President. And we're waiting right now. We had over 70 people register for this event. Right now we have 42 people entered. So we're just going to hang out for a moment and give other people a chance to get into our presentation. This presentation is being recorded. And what we're going to do is, you probably noticed, we are doing a webinar format and not a Zoom meeting. So in a webinar format, unfortunately, you are not able to see all of the participants, and actually neither are we. And what I want you to draw your attention to is on the lower toolbar, you'll see that we have a chat room and a raise your hand. But what I hope you do is put your questions and comments in the chat room. And that way you will be able to write your questions while we're doing the presentation. And you'll be able, then I will be able to follow your concerns and your questions throughout. We will try to address questions at the end of the presentation. I also am drawing your attention to the chat room because I just posted all of the web links that our presenters are doing today and that they're using, so that you know that you'll have access to some of the materials that are being presented. In addition to recording today, we will be posting the PowerPoint slides as a PDF format, also on the website, so that you are able to access those later. All right, I have almost 5:20, so we're going to go ahead and start. I am Renee Gralowitz, as I said, League of Women Voters Appleton Vice President of Programs. We are a nonpartisan political organization, and we are well respected because we're nonpartisan. So please keep that in mind as you're posting comments in the chat room, is that we are not here to talk about individual legislators or elected officials. We're here to talk about policies and what is going on in our community. Next slide, please.
And good evening. My name is Cindy Filona, and I am the Membership Director for the League of Women Voters of Appleton. And in attendance tonight, we have 4 of the 6 new members that you can see listed on this slide. And so I do want to warmly welcome Brianne Conley, Vanessa Saby, Nancy Vilko-Krause, and Tracy Tice. These are all brand new members, and we're delighted that they're here for this very informative program tonight. And just a little plug here for the League of Women Voters, if you'd like to know more about us. If you'd like to consider joining our fabulous group, go to lwvappleton.org. You'll find out lots of information about us. There's an option to join there, and we welcome any concerns or questions you might have. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Shirley.
Thank you. This is Shirley Strange, and I am chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Tonight, we begin this evening by acknowledging that Appleton is located on the traditional homeland of the Menominee Nation. In Wisconsin, there are 10 other federally recognized Native American sovereign nations, as well as the Brothertown Nation, not yet federally recognized. By acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional land of these sovereign nations, We honor the people and the land. We are indebted to the Native people who have always been and continue to be faithful stewards of planet Earth and all its living creatures. This evening, we look at one of the 12 tribes, the Wisconsin Oneida. The Wisconsin Oneida, originally from New York and one of the 6 nations of the League of the Iroquois, reside in northeastern Wisconsin near Green Bay. The Oneida are the people of the Standing Stone. According to Oneida tradition, there was always a large red boulder near the main Oneida village in New York. The journey to Wisconsin for the Oneida group was arduous, yet their determination to live in harmony with all other beings in the area helped them to survive and thrive. We acknowledge their love of this land, which they now call home. And we, all of us, must treat each other with dignity and respect and learn from each other. And together we can solve our problems and protect our democracy and be keepers of the earth.
Thank you, Shirley. Jean?
Thank you. I am Jean Roberts. I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Appleton. And welcome to our monthly program on what is being taught in our history classes. Just a little bit of League history. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that began 101 years ago as the natural outgrowth of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And we were intended to help newly enfranchised women learn how to register and vote and become educated voters. The League has unfortunately left much of their own history and the history of women's suffrage out. As my friend Karen reminded me, Black women fought as hard as white women for the right to vote, knowing all along that they would not reap the benefits. Also left out of the suffrage history were the stories of other groups of people: Asian women, Indigenous women, Latinx women, LGBTQ, and more. And if women's history has been left out of what is being taught, you know that the history of these additional groups of people have been left out even more. The League's mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. And last June, the League elevated their commitment to diversity to being as important as their commitment to nonpartisanship. And that is why we put on programs like we are today, because the League of Women Voters is committed to empowering all voters and defending democracy for all. In early March, we will be hosting nonpartisan candidate forums for school board and for all Appleton Common Council positions that are being contested. Feel free to send any questions to our email at league.appleton@yahoo.com for those forums. We will also be conducting 2 more educational forums in March and April. Information is on our website and will be shared later in this program. Last year, we conducted 2 Zoom discussion groups, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man and Say Her Name / Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. We will plan to do something similar this summer. Our most recent study group has just completed the second of their 2-year study on climate change preparedness and resilience, and has also completed videos regarding their research that are included on our webpage, lwvappleton.org. Look for the video tab on the left side of the homepage. Finally, we would like to give a special thanks to all of the parents, grandparents, teachers and other school staff, school board, and especially our children for their struggles and hard work in making it through this incredibly difficult and unprecedented school year. Thank you for everything you have done.
Next slide, please. Great, thank you, Jean. Tonight, we are going to be talking about public schools and U.S. diversity and history education, which also includes social studies and civics. And this topic came to light over the summer when we realized that so many of our fellow U.S. citizens were really uninformed about the realities and life existence of our minority populations. We found out this summer that in 8 minutes and 46 seconds, was the lifespan of a Black man in an encounter with a police officer. We also learned that missing and murdered Indigenous women go underreported and unrecognized and often uninvestigated. So throughout those conversations we had this summer, a lot of people, myself included, were saying, well, I didn't know that. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Where was I supposed to learn about the diversity in the United States throughout my education? And today we're going to be looking at and discussing how representation or misrepresentation, self-representation of all of our diversity, of our strength as the United Nations, is presented in our public education system here in Wisconsin. The United States has always been engaged in this social project. We were the first state, the first nation in the world that included this great diversity and said, okay, you get to be a citizen too, and you get to be a citizen. And oh, by the way, you can also be a citizen. So this great diversity, this project at work is messy. We've seen that in the summer of 2020, it's messy. But it can become less messy if we become educated in what's going on and the history of the United States in particular. To start us off, I want to remind you that you need to put your questions in the chat room because we'll address those at the end as time permits. And I will be monitoring the chat room to look for that. We're going to start off today with Steve Harrison, the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction for the Appleton Area School District, followed by Chris McDaniel's presentation. And unfortunately, Chris McDaniel has had a family emergency and she will not be present, but we will go ahead and read her slides and do her presentation for her. Then we're going to conclude with a teacher's experience, his experience in the Appleton Area School District on how he handled the lack of information, misinformation, representation, or great information that was presented in the textbooks that he was using or chose not to use. So I will let Tom explain that all. So let me introduce to you, Stephen Harrison. Your turn, Steve.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for this opportunity to be able to join you this evening. Really appreciate this time with you and have a short presentation that I'd like to use in support of today's important conversation. All right, so as was shared out, my name is Steve Harrison and I'm serve in the role of Assistant Superintendent for Assessment, Curriculum, and Instruction in the Appleton Area School District. This is my second year in this role and my 6th year overall in the district. Within the Appleton Area School District, we have just under 16,000 students. And so being the 6th largest school district in the state of Wisconsin, we are fortunate to have a number of district level administrators who also support the delivery of curriculum and instruction among all of our grade levels. Within the Assessment, Curriculum, and Instruction Department, we have 4 different curriculum directors. 2 of them who intentionally focus on elementary level grades, and 2 of them that focus on our secondary, our grades 7 through 12 courses. And so Linda Kuhat is our elementary social studies curriculum director, and Linda Vanny is our secondary social studies curriculum director. And so they certainly could provide more in-depth and detailed accounts as far as the implementation of instructional activities and materials, knowing they work directly with teachers who implement and support the instruction within social studies. But I'm here tonight to also provide a broad overview of the work we've done within the Appleton Area School District as it relates to implementing culturally competent curriculum and instruction. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview here, I'd like to share with you the context behind our work at large in the Appleton Area School District. What does this mean as far as implications for our instructional materials? How does this impact our designing of courses as well as lesson planning, as well as implications for our overall instruction? And so when we first think of culturally and linguistically responsive practices within the Appleton Area School District, this is something that is collectively owned by all of us within the AASD. As you can see, hopefully on this slide, our motto as a district is success for every student every day. And that is to support our vision of a future of working together. Students, families, staff, and community will ensure that each graduate is academically, socially, and emotionally prepared for success in life, every student, every day. And so the 4 pillars that serve as the foundation of our work overall are inclusive, engaging culture to support teaching and learning, student success, family and community partners and partnerships, and resources and operational excellence. And I would say that today's topic in particular really applies to the first 3 pillars of making sure that our culture is inclusive and engaging for our learning, that we are focusing on overall student success. It's not just the academic focus, but the whole child overall, and that we cannot do our work without the support and partnerships of our families and our community overall. And so as a district, we do have an overall equity plan, which is part of the links that have been shared with you within the chat. And within the equity plan as a district, we have 4 overall goals. The first 2 you can see on the slide here, where goal number 1 focuses on classroom practices, and goal number 2 focuses on school climate. And for today's presentation, really looking at goal number 1, where our goal is to infuse culturally responsive practices in our classrooms and our buildings, to have culturally responsive practices that include those that are free from discrimination, from bias, and being welcome and inclusive, as well as responsive to our diverse experiences and needs of our community. In addition, we have 2 other goals. Goal 3, which relates to curriculum and materials, and that is to assure that the curriculum, instructional practices, and assessments are free of discrimination and bias, while also celebrating the diversity of humankind. And then finally, goal number 4, co-curricular involvement. So again, it's really goal number 1, instruction, and goal number 3, curriculum and materials, that I'm focusing on as part of tonight's overall presentation. Now, as part of the Appleton Area School District, we do recognize, again, as alluded to before, that we are part of a larger community. And one of the many reasons I've always been so thankful to be a member of the Appleton Area School District is, again, these communication partnerships, community partnerships that we have. And Dr. Judy Baseman has done a really great job of making sure that we keep dignity and respect at the forefront of all of our conversations and all of our interactions, both within the district and throughout the communities which we serve. This campaign officially was launched several years ago, but continues to be a main focus of all the work we do within our district. And knowing that a key component of making sure that we follow a process of both the dignity and respect is making sure that we are advancing equity. In order to advance equity, we cannot do that with also developing cultural competence. And so this quote taken from Sonia Kaus-Gleason and Nancy Gerson really resonates with me, because it says, with greater cultural competence, educators develop a greater understanding and appreciation of the range of backgrounds represented by both students and adults at their school, and to improve the capacity to engage, challenge, and support our students. And when we think of our pillar relating to student success, as well as our pillar 1 of having an inclusive and engaging culture and environment for learning, what better way to do that and lift up all students by focusing, again, on advancing equity. And so within the Appleton Area School District, first and foremost, I would like to share that this is a journey that we are on. It is an overall process. It's not something we treat as an event or even as a collection of events. By no means are we saying that we have all the different challenges solved when it comes to equity. Just like any district, and in particular any larger district, we continue to face a number of challenges every day and every week with our students and staff. but it's making sure that we continue along that journey and continue to build our capacity overall. And part of that work has been in the form of working with Dr. Shraki Holly to build our own internal cultural competence. And part of that is recognizing the rings of culture that do exist within society. That when we think of our own experiences, aside from those of others we interact with, we may view our rings of culture different than those that we serve. And so again, it's making sure we provide opportunities for all these various rings of culture, whether it's your age, your perceived gender, religious culture, socioeconomic culture, national culture, orientation culture, and ethnic culture, that all of these together, just like layers of an onion, come together to form who we each are individually, as well as overall cultures at large. And so knowing the importance of this work and the context that it provides, really thinking about what are the implications for instructional materials in the Appleton Area School District. And again, I'd like to preface this with it's not just specific to high school social studies or middle level, or even that of what's learned at the elementary level, that this really applies to all instructional content areas and all grade levels. And just like learning literacy and reading is not something we solely rely on our English language art teachers, cultural competence is not something that we solely rely on any one department as well. This is something we all collectively own as a district. And so we do think of our materials as being opportunities to provide our students with both mirrors and windows for life. And what we mean by that is we want to make sure that students can see themselves and their own cultures, as you saw within those rings of culture, as part of their learning, that they can truly see themselves within the learning experience, but they can also see the cultures of others as well, particularly cultures that they may not have normally been exposed to. And so this has been a collective effort within our district as well, to make sure that, again, when we think of our instructional materials, that we're providing opportunities for students to see themselves and their own lives reflected in those resources, but also making sure that they're being provided opportunities of windows as well to not only learn about others, but to help develop a sense of empathy. And so when I think of myself as an educator, I think of, what are the resources and books that I've read in my own past and how that's developed my own sense of my individual worldview. And then how does that compare to not only what my own students would be reading, but the resources that I would share with them in the classroom as well. And so this is certainly where it becomes important to think of our own implicit biases that we bring to education. And so when we think of adopting instructional materials at all levels in the Appleton Area School District, there's really 4 key parts that we want to make sure are aligned to our cultural competence work. First is making sure that they align to our guiding principles, which again are grounded in creating culturally competent instruction. We make sure that those who participate within our work groups for identifying materials are also part of a broader range of representation, such as making sure we have representation from special education, from making sure that we include also our teachers of English language learning students and so on. We also provide a 30-day public input for all of our materials prior to going forward to the school board to make sure that that input is not only solicited, but reviewed prior to anything then being put forward for official adoption by the Appleton Area School District Board of Education. And this is certainly important because not only does it help prepare our students for being college and career ready and ready for their communities, but we also know that when students can see themselves in their learning, they become more motivated and as well as more engaged. But finally, it's because of also the importance of having and creating a socially just world that we see the relevance of this material. And so as we think of what does this mean for designing instruction within the Appleton Area School District, several things come to mind. What you are seeing on the left side are the 4 pillars that drive our work. And on the right side are the overall processes we engage in when we develop courses for instruction. So for example, when we think of, what our units of study are, the essential questions that need to be addressed, what does that pathway of learning look like, or those learning progressions? How will we assess our students and make sure that our assessments are common practices throughout the district? But finally, when we think of the overall component of these other important pieces as far as connecting beyond the curriculum, you'll notice that towards the bottom here, we have what's called the Pause and Reflect Equity Framework. And so that's what I'll speak to on a little bit more of a broader sense here for all of our courses within the AASD. And the reason why we use a protocol and equity to design our instruction is, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, that to take that first step in faith. You don't need to see the whole staircase, but it's important to take that first step. And part of that first step is taking our own cultural competence journey to really, as educators, be reflective of several things. One being that we are called to be change agents as educators to create a more socially just world, but to also reflect inward, again, on what are the different implicit biases we also bring to our own craft of teaching. And so there's a whole lot of reasons for why it's important to really use a protocol for establishing more equitable practices in our lesson planning. And here you just see some of those key bullets that I certainly won't take the time during tonight's presentation to read through each part, knowing you will have access, if you don't already, to this presentation. But certainly all four of these really speak to the heart of why we really focus on creating those equitable learning experiences in our lesson planning. And so when we think overall of what does this mean, again, I'm probably giving you more of the elevator speech of our Pause and Reflect for Equity framework, but I do just very briefly want to share with you a couple key components of what that means. So when we think of developing courses of instruction and updating our instruction within the AASD, part of that work beyond the actual curriculum component is really thinking about these key steps that are part of that process. You heard me talk about engaging in a cultural literacy journey. Again, focusing first on what do I bring as an educator to my instruction? What are the pieces of information or misinformation perhaps that have been part of my own upbringing that I need to make sure I'm not only aware of, but also continue to act on? How do I build teacher-student relationships? By making sure I honor visibility and voice. And you'll notice that the phrase VAB is listed here, and I'll very briefly touch on that in a moment. How do we make sure that we have collaborative conversations within our instruction, making sure that our learning activities are relevant to our students' background, their learning styles, as well as the family and communities that they come from? How do we ensure that we are creating a process where every student has high education, high quality education, not based on chance, but based on design overall? And to do that, we focus on making sure that our lessons are standards-based so that we all agree as a professional learning community what we want our students to know and be able to do. To provide feedback for our students so they understand where they are, as well as where they need to go in their learning. And so again, within this overall framework, we have some different areas that we use to vet our instruction design, thinking about our lesson planning, and how do we ensure that as part of our practices, again, we are creating a more culturally competent framework of instruction. And so the final piece here to bring my portion of our presentation to a close is thinking about the many different common cultural behaviors that our students come from within the Appleton Area School District. Again, as a larger school district, we are stronger by the fact that we have many students from many different cultures, many different spoken languages that create such a diverse fabric throughout our entire district. And part of where we are continuing to build more of our own cultural competence, in particular through our work with Dr. Shraki Holly, is through what we call vabbing. And again, at your own leisure, you'll notice that there are some links here that will provide you with additional information. One of them being a short clip of Dr. Holly and what exactly vabbing is. And certainly he can do a much better job than I can as far as providing that overview. But here I'll just leave you with a couple key parts of this. Again, really emphasizing that this is on all of us as educators at all levels to really make sure that we are providing a culturally competent education and environment for our students, that we will validate our students, that we will make legitimate things that institutions and mainstream have traditionally not made legitimate through negative labels and negative stereotypes. To validate, again, means to make sure we're providing a counter narrative to our students and making sure they know that those are not just labels. We need to affirm our students, and that is important to make sure we are intentionally and purposely making sure we address negative stereotypes and images and representations that we do historically find within our texts and materials. We need to ensure by, again, honoring the home culture and language that we're building with our families and with our students through our instruction, and that we build an understanding and recognize the cultural and language or linguistic behaviors of our students, that we are making an investment in our students through this process. And finally, how are we bridging into the future, but also bridging into these different rings of culture that our students have? How do we provide opportunities for situational appropriateness for either cultural or linguistic behaviors? How do we bridge as far as providing academic and social skills that students need for success beyond our classrooms? And how do we make sure that what we do with our students is providing them success for not only navigating school, but navigating mainstream culture as well? So certainly within our time restraints of this evening, this is just kind of a broad overview of the work that's been taking place in the Appleton Area School District. But again, it's coming back to that ownership that we all collectively have in creating culturally and linguistically responsive environments for our students. And again, just I come back to one of the great things about working within the AASD is that we do this work collaboratively with our community partners. So I certainly thank you for your time and attention during this part of the presentation, and I will turn things over to Renee.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Steve. That really was an awful lot of information in such a short period of time. And I had the opportunity to read it in advance. So thank you so much. And I hope that we get some questions put into the chat room for you. And perhaps at the end of the presentation, you'll have more time to expound on a few ideas. Cindy, can you put the PowerPoint up, please? Great, thank you so much. Now, unfortunately, Chris McDaniel had a family emergency, and so she's not able to be here with us. And I can tell you, I am not going to do her presentation proud. So please continue, Cindy. Chris works for Wisconsin's Department of Public Instruction. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, they are part of the governing body of what our K-12 education is supposed to have and be like. But in addition, they have a vast amount of resources on their website. And Chris is the social studies resource go-to person for Wisconsin educators. Next slide, please. All of these web links are in the chat room, and I hope you'll get a chance to copy and paste them on another sheet for yourself. But click the Wisconsin standards for me, please, Cindy. Go up and click the title, Wisconsin Standards for Social Studies. Thank you. And hopefully this will work. And not so much. This web link has all of the standards available on what is supposed to be taught at what levels and what is an acceptable curriculum. So with that type of curriculum that's presented, social studies teachers, oh, thank you, are able to see what the standards are for each of those. And Cindy, we're not going to go through all of those pages, but I wanted the audience to see what that document looks like. It's a PDF and it's available. It's public access document. So thank you. And now we got to go back to the webinar. Oh boy, you're doing great, Barb. Thank you. I called you another name before. Sorry. So this is Barb who's helping me here. Thank you. So Chris is responsible for making sure that the state standards are met, and not only that they're met, but that they're understood. Next slide, please. On page 50 of that PDF that you have access to from the chat web links that are posted, you'll see that the history standards are really detailed, and they give and teachers, they give our educators a great starting foundation on the types of modules and curriculum that they should be presenting to their classes. And again, Chris is the go-to person when you have questions or you're planning a module or you need help presenting, for example, Native American or Indigenous studies that is not on Thanksgiving and that is not part of the Indigenous Studies Month. You go to Chris and she's able to help you with that. Next slide, please. State requirements is also, we're not going to click that link because it is a state document, and the document is really clearly defined on minimum requirements for our educators. Next slide, please. The goals and expectations are really important. And what Chris wanted to convey with this slide is that in 2017, it was revised. And there is a grandfather clause for students who started their education before 2017, but there was a new guidance that was put out in 2017. Next slide, please. And this is her last slide. We're not going to click any of these hyperlinks. All of these links are available to you in the chat room, and they are available for all of us. These are public domain. And with that public domain, I find it, I'm a retired university professor, and I often went to DPI to see what was being presented there. And I was able to use some of their resources for my university classes as well. So we hope Chris's family is safe. We hope everybody is sound and that family are able to recover soon. So next slide, please. That's Chris's email address if you'd like to contact her. She is very gracious. She's a very helpful person. And thank you very much, Kristen, for being willing to be part of our presentation. Let me introduce you now to Tom. So he is our retired Appleton Area School District person, and you can close up that slide until our conclusions. So Tom, go ahead and unmute yourself. And I will let you introduce yourself, talk about all of what you have done for our students and for our community as an educator. Thank you so much.
Good evening to everyone. Can you hear me? Renee, okay. I am Tom Clementi, and as I look at my calendar here, I see that I started teaching 48 years ago this week in the town of Waiawega. If you don't know where that is, it's 30 miles west of Appleton, and it's a very small place. I taught there for 3.5 years and then was hired to teach at Appleton West High School, and I spent 25 years there, 5 years at Appleton North, and I retired in 2006. I did subbing at North High School for several years, and I finally stopped doing that in 2019. What I taught was about almost anything you can imagine in both the English and social studies departments, everything from low-level English to advanced speech, to regular US history, to humanities and AP art history. So there's a wide variety of things that I did there, including one very nice year where I was able to teach gifted and talented seventh graders in both English and social studies, which was both a challenge and a learning experience. I guess what I want to say here is that there's a lot of ways you can approach the social studies stuff. And I think all of us are aware of the fact that you can get a textbook and you get workbooks and there's worksheets and questions at the end of the chapters and review sheets from the workbook. And then there's chapter tests and unit tests. And if you want to do that, you can do that. But I found that that provides just a very cursory, generalized, glossed over view of history. And sometimes I think that I didn't do a very good job because I see what happens on my television, and very frankly, I often think that Americans have a very limited view of our own history. And I think it's sad. And I discovered soon after starting teaching history, be it world history, humanities, US history, that I had to augment that, which means I had to get smarter. And I wound up doing a great deal of research and reading on my own and developing my own materials and coming up with ideas to help my students understand more in depth of what they're doing here and why are they here. And sometimes you do that by asking questions. I would ask my students, why are you here? They didn't know what I was talking about. And then I would follow that up and say, no. Why are you here? Most of you are not Native Americans. You're English, you're French, you're Polish, you're Italian, you're whatever. What are you doing here? Why is your family here? And very, very few of them knew. I would make an assignment to go home and find out what in the world they're doing here. And why did they pick living in Wisconsin? I had a very difficult time with that myself. My family, everybody in my family, all my ancestors are from Sicily. And I used to ask my grandfather, my mother's dad, what are we doing here? Sicily is not 20 below. Is there some reason we couldn't settle in a warm place? And that would make life easier. And all I got was a shrug of the shoulders and said that, the jobs were not there, but they were in the north. And that brings up one of the things that really got to me. And if you look in a US history book and they talk about immigration, you talk about generalized, that's it. And it really doesn't give any kind of depth. And I wound up making this an assignment with my students to find out what they're doing here. And I would tell them how I got here. And to me, it's one of the most important things. In fact, even after I retired, I had a teacher come in and tell this to his students because he thought it was important. And the fact that the reason I am here is that my grandfather, who was born in 1899 and was one of 7 children, in 1912, and that's the same year as the Titanic, so I could make that reference to the students. His father, my great-grandfather, and my great-grandmother decided that one of their children needed to get out because they could feel the war, World War I, was coming. And so my great-grandfather and my 13-year-old grandfather got on a boat from Palermo, went to New York, went the whole Ellis Island experience, got on a train and went to Milwaukee. And my great-grandfather set my grandfather up in a boarding house on the east side, got him a job at the Pabst Brewery. And once that was done, returned to Sicily. And my grandfather was here by himself at age 13, not knowing anyone and not knowing the language. Now, somehow, my grandfather carved a life out of this. And he had 5 daughters with my grandmother. They were married for, oh, Lord, 60 some odd years. And multitudes of grandchildren. And I am here because of that. And I am always grateful to my grandfather that somehow he did something at 13 years of age I can't imagine myself doing that he did. But he's not alone in this. There have to be thousands of Americans whose family history is similar to that. So that's something that's not in the textbook. That's something that has to be delved into because it'll help students understand the immigration story a lot more than a couple of columns on page 351 of a textbook. They need to understand that. Why are they here? How did they get here? And who are the people whose shoulders they stand upon? I went to college. I have a graduate degree. That's certain. My dad only has a grade school education. And, you know, the fact that he worked that hard, which allowed me to have a life far different than his. And here I sit as a retired person in Appleton, comfortable, is a credit to him, to my grandfather, and to all of my ancestors that came before me. And I think it's important that students understand that, but it's not in the book. And so you have to go out of your way, away from the book to do that. And that also helps with the diversity because there's so many different people. If you've ever been to Ellis Island, I think you know what I'm talking about. I can remember taking pictures and bringing them back to my students and almost crying during the presentation for these people that were literally carrying their lives in their hands, in a suitcase, a beat up one, and came to America to try and start it all over again, no matter when it might be. The diversity thing also, I think of the Native Americans, and I always think of difficulty in teaching the what was called the Indian experience, the Trail of Tears from the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson ignored the Supreme Court, who ruled that the Cherokees did have treaty rights to land in Georgia. Jackson said, "This is too preposterous." That's a quote. And ordered the army to move the natives out. And so over a period of years that extended even into Martin Van Buren's administration, they were moved out from Georgia, from Mississippi, all the way into Oklahoma. And along the way, untold thousands of them died. The Trail of Tears. And sometimes, if students wonder, well, why is there animosity between natives and whites? Well, you don't have to look much farther than that. That can lead to other things, like Jackson's often regarded as a very, very good president, but that's a pretty black stain on him. So that causes a whole diversity thing, and it gives them an idea of what would happen to you if you had to do that. What would happen to me if the government came and ordered me to walk from Wisconsin to Montana? and start a new life there on some empty property? Would I even be able to walk? Would I make it? Would I die along the way? Would it be my own personal trail of tears? I think those things are very, very important. One of the other things I discovered, and it's still true, is that textbooks themselves can cause issues. For instance, the biggest textbook buyer in the United States is the state of Texas, because as many of you know, the state of Texas has one school board which buys books for the entire state, so that every high school in the state of Texas has the same U.S. history textbooks. Well, what Texas then decides is a good or a bad winds up in these textbooks that so many other people, like in Wisconsin, can get. And some years ago, the state of Texas decided that they had an approved list of worldwide revolutionaries. And one of the people they took out of that was Thomas Jefferson. Now, my feeling, and I'm sure many of yours, is that Jefferson is one of the great revolutionaries of all time. And the Declaration of Independence is this ultimate piece of this ultimate document in Western history, along with Magna Carta. And yet in the state of Texas, he was removed as an approved revolutionary. And he was replaced with, of all people, St. Thomas Aquinas. You know, certainly is the father of scholasticism, but, you know, in my mind, I wonder, is that a revolutionary? And so you don't, perhaps I had to go more into Jefferson, who he was. My own trips to Monticello were certainly a help, but to give them an idea of who this man was. And yes, he was a slave owner, indeed. But he also did any number of great things, which you already know and can look up. I'm not going to waste your time. But this is a very diverse man himself. And I thought, this is not someone who should be ridden out of our history simply because somebody in Texas didn't like that. And so I gave my students more of Jefferson than was in the textbook. And had I not done that, their knowledge of Jefferson and perhaps all of his compatriots in Philadelphia and in Virginia and in Boston, my students wouldn't know as much if I didn't do that. I think things like that are important, and you have to go deeper than what the textbook manufacturers want to give you. You need to read on your own, develop your own stuff. Yes, it's a lot of work. Teaching is certainly more work than I ever bargained for when I was 20 years old. I don't know if the Hindus are right and I get to come back as somebody else. I don't know if I'll do it again. But I noticed that in order to do a good job, there was a lot of work that was beyond ordinary regular lesson planning. And let's open it up to chapter 6. And today's Monday, and by Wednesday, I want you to answer all the odd numbered questions at the end of the chapter. That's no way to do it. That's how I went to high school. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why I became a history teacher, because I really felt there had to be a better way to reach the students. Whether I did or not, I don't know. I hope so. But the textbooks do certain things, and I'm not knocking them all the time, but it's just not enough. Even the people in the books, like Jefferson and Washington, and you know, they're more than people that are pictures on a dollar bill or on pictures that you might see in a city hall. They're real people. And yes, they had pluses, they had minuses, they had faults, they had feelings. and we learn from them. I'm not going to be in anybody's textbook 300 years from now, but a lot of the reason those people are in there is because they did something. They did something that we can look at, and it might not be something, that they wrote or anything like that. But, you know, I always say I have a love affair with art history, and I very much love Michelangelo. And all you have to do is see David or see the Sistine ceiling, and you say, yeah, I guess he contributed to who we are. Not bad. Or Leonardo or anything like that. Yet there's more to these people. What a lot of people don't know, probably most of you, is that Michelangelo's poetry is this thick, an entire book of it. It's absolutely amazing. I wish I could write that well. But these people have a lot going for them in their lives, all of them, from Jefferson to Leonardo to anybody else. And what they provided us is sort of a map. You can follow it, you can not follow it. You can say what they did was great or maybe not so great. But there isn't any doubt that they are our history. And to ignore them, to just gloss them over with a couple of sheets out of a workbook, that's not good enough. And maybe that's why sometimes I have found, and I've been lucky enough to go to Europe probably 10 times. Those people seem to know their history better than we do. And I think that's sad because I wish we knew ours more. Okay, I think that's, I'm sure I've talked enough.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. As a Mohican, a Polish Mohican myself, I am often more concerned not about who's in the books, but who's been left out of the textbooks. And as a scholar myself, I'm an anthropologist and a sociologist. Like you do your own research and you present that. I chose to become a post-secondary instructor because I wanted the freedom to create my own curriculum. I did not want to, we had some departmental, they must, know these questions, the answer to these questions, but we were not as conscripted as I think K-12 is. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing about the standards for K-12. And I hope, Steve, you unmute yourself and join us in this conversation here. Because I would like to know how much leeway, there's like you, Tom, you've expressed it clearly, there's just so many cool things that we'd love our students to know. And there's just, I mean, they don't really want to work 20 hours a day just on your class. So there comes a choice where we have to pick and choose, and I call that censorship. I tell my students, you're being censored because I'm asking you to focus on these people here. Is as a Polish Mohican, a Pohican, I would like to know that my ancestors are included. And not only that, we know about Pocahontas, we know about Crazy Horse, and we know about the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee. But we had a Trail of Tears with the Potawatomi here in Wisconsin. My ancestors who are here in Wisconsin and who actually came from New York area, they're not included in textbooks until you get to university level. And I think that's a concern of mine. So Steve, Tom, I'd like to open this up and talk about how much time do social studies and history teachers get a chance to pick and choose which part of the history they want to present. So let's start with Steve first, because Tom, you just finished. Have a drink of water.
Yeah, so thank you. And, I think that brings up a really important topic as well, that oftentimes in education, I think we interchange the words curriculum and materials as if they're one and the same. And really we're talking about two different, very different things that, again, oftentimes get blended together. So what I mean by that is our curriculum consists of what are those essential understandings within the course overall as part of the instruction? What are those course specific standards, instructional standards that you referenced before, Renee, that, whether they're social studies standards or math standards or, whatever the case might be. And those are the overarching components that make up really what we would call our guaranteed and viable curriculum, right? So what are we saying that as a district, all of our students, not just students that would have, teacher A or teacher B, but again, coming back to that theme of making sure that all of our students receive a great education because of the design and not because of chance of who they maybe had as a teacher. And so when you think about your question about, flexibility and autonomy, that curriculum piece is really, what are we saying that all students, no matter which high school they go to in a particular district or which teacher they may have, we want to ensure that all means all, right? And when it comes to materials, a couple key things about that. At least within the Appleton Area School District, we ensure that whatever our primary source of instructional materials, which again would be the materials that support the delivery of the curriculum, are adopted for that entire course. So that again, you're not having one book if you're with teacher A and a different book for another teacher. But alongside that, we also recognize the importance of the fact that there's an art and science to teaching, right? That we don't want to develop a system where a teacher is only considered as highly qualified as the textbook he or she has in front of them, because I think that does a tremendous disservice to our educators overall. And so with that, we make sure we have that level of consistency, which would be the curriculum. We have a board adopted primary resource for supporting the delivery of that curriculum. But then we also recognize that, again, when we think of that art and craft of teaching, that teachers are going to have a variety of supplemental means to enhance the delivery of that curriculum. And what I learned as a previous science teacher was the challenges we would face and continue to face in education, where in some cases, the content of your book can become outdated by the time you receive it from the publisher. And I think that's especially important, not just with the facts and figures, but when we think of the cultural relevance. I've served as a reviewer for textbooks of a couple different companies, and each time it would really be startling to me when my feedback to that company was, I only see one or two different types of students. For example, in this book, you print this in 2020, it's already outdated. We need to make sure that what we have is relevant. So I think that all comes together as far as making sure that we rely on updated resources, but also ensuring that we have that pathway to a guaranteed and viable curriculum for our students.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the difference between curriculum and materials, that's a great point. That never crossed my mind. But again, who picks those materials though?
Good question. So again, I can only speak to my experiences here in the Appleton Area School District, that when we look at the materials that are going to support the delivery of the curriculum, we think again of the slide I referenced before of within our internal processes, how are we ensuring that, let me use an example in the science world. If I'm a biology teacher and are looking for a book to support the delivery of that curriculum, I need to ensure, am I including teachers that lead into this course? Because again, I'm one piece of the puzzle as an educator in this child's education. Am I also including educators of various courses, not just one, but a variety of courses that this student will then go off into after he or she has had me as a teacher? Am I ensuring that of the different areas that we support students, is that being represented within the selection process? So when I had done this in my previous role in the district, I would make sure that I had teachers from special education department as part of this process, looking for things such as different ways to access the instruction or the materials that are there, readability issues. Do we have different ways of providing accommodations? But then also, do I have teachers that represent students whose primary language is not English? So how am I incorporating teachers from our EL department, which have been just an invaluable part of that process? Also, when we think of more of that comprehensive component, we're fortunate in the Appleton Area School District to have CLR coaches, which are cultural and linguistically responsive coaches, such as what I referred to before. So I see that as a huge benefit because, again, when we think of our mirrors and our windows, we need to really look in a critical manner of our materials as we review them to see, do all of our students see themselves in these materials and their various layers or circles of culture? And then do they also have opportunities to see others? But I haven't yet talked about the community piece, right? So again, that's something that I've really valued in being in the Appleton Area School District is then how are we ensuring, pandemic or not, how are we ensuring we have opportunities for our community at large to have a review of our materials? So, in the past, we would put those out physically, but then in the pandemic in the last year, we've recognized the need to provide those digitally as well, so that we can take that input, process that if any is received as a work group, and share that with the board. That's also an important piece, that when we come forward to our school board then for the actual adoption of the materials, one of the great questions they always ask is, have you received any feedback from the community? And if so, what has that been? And so we need to make sure that we're, saying, here's generally the themes that we collected from the feedback, and here's how we responded accordingly, or at least vetted through as part of our decision-making process.
Great. Thank you so much. Tom?
Yeah, I don't want anybody to think that I didn't follow the curriculum. That was done. But I had to find a way to get the other stuff in. And so I did, as much as possible. The students were responsible for the textbooks, to be sure. We would talk about what they read, but I always felt I had to add things to that. And one of the things I'd mentioned to you, Renee, was that, again, this whole thing of not having enough. I remember when the textbooks in U.S. history, we get to the 1960s. This is where I got so discouraged. And for instance, John F. Kennedy's administration, they would talk about Kennedy being elected and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then he dies. Well, there's a lot more than that. And because I could remember that, and particularly because I'd gone to a Catholic grade school, and yet I lived on a completely Protestant block. And so that whole thing about, if Kennedy is elected, he's going to take orders from the Pope. The fact that the Ku Klux Klan came out against him. I can remember all that stuff. And that was dominant. And then at the same time, I can remember the fact that we had two little kids in the White House. And they were younger than I was. And Carolyn wanted a pony. And because the Kennedys were rich, she could get one, and she named it Macaroni. And that whole thing, all of that stuff, the fact that the Kennedys would go water skiing, and it would drive the Secret Service crazy because they'd have to keep up on water skis and in boats with them. All that kind of stuff. And then, as it continues, these are all those things I could remember. And it was, and so certainly when I got to that point, I probably had more of myself in the course than the textbook, simply because I thought my memories were more interesting than a printed word. And
it's nice.
I believe that.
It is so important that these people in those books become real people, whether it's natural science or social science, that the individuals are given their humanity, good, bad, warts and all.
Oh, yeah. I remember in 1968, George Wallace running for president.
Yep.
He came to Racine, where I came from, and had a huge overflow meeting and rally, and it was just crazy. And of course, because Racine has significant non-white population, those people weren't particularly happy. So, and that included people I went to high school with and all that. So we had our own sociology meeting about that because of that. Well, that's not in the book.
Right. Thank
That
you so
isn't in the
much.
book. And so
Yeah.
that was, I always thought that was important for me to give that to my students.
It is, and I hear very good things about you, Tom. That is how come I reached out to you, is a lot of people remember. And I'm sure Steve with the same way, is that individual touch that our educators put in the classroom. That is so important for not just our students, our children, that's important for our community. That we know that these are human beings and that these human beings have flaws. And even if they're flawed, that doesn't mean they're a horrible person overall. And it is that kind of breadth in education that I think is really important for not just the United States, but for global citizenship. So we're going to wrap it up. Thank you both for presenting, giving us your time. It's been wonderful. Barb, will you put up the second to last slide, I think? So as we're concluding here, these are some of our upcoming events for the League of Women Voters Appleton. I did not see any questions placed in the chat room, but I hope that we answered a lot of questions you had. I know that the presentations today gave me a lot of information about how our Appleton area school district education in history and social studies is thought about, that it is a well thought out plan and there are structures and processes, but there's also that freedom for our educators to not embellish, but to enhance the lessons that are in the materials. So feel free to join us if you have comments about our programs. Next slide, please. You can, oh, I don't think the next slide's going to work, but you can contact us through our website, or you can email us at League of Women Voter at lwvappleton@yahoo.com and give us your input. We have the candidate forums coming up. We are the League of Women Voters, and our mission is to defend democracy and to make sure that we have an educated voting population. So we have the forums coming up. Please feel free to join us and look on our website for those links. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you attending. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.